Hello, Michal.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I am so happy to be here with you today. First of all, because I've heard so much about you and I've always wanted to have a conversation with you. So, this is the great opportunity to do it. And also because you're opening this special interview series on women in politics that I've been wanting to do for a very, very long time. So, thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the time. And I'm sure we're going to have a great time together.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the opportunity.
You're very welcome. So let me start by, first of all, welcoming anyone who is joining us. I would love for you to type in the comments who you are, where you're from, if this is the first time that you're joining us, and we'll have an opportunity for Michal to answer any questions that you have. So please stay tuned, type in your questions or your comments. I'm going to start by reading Michal's bio, so we know who she is. Obviously, everyone knows who she is, but we have a little bit more information to share with you, and then we'll dive in the interview. So let me start by saying that Michal Cotler-Wunsh was born in Israel and grew up in Canada, and she is a member of the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament. Michal is committed to promoting, advancing, and protecting the rule of law, human rights, Israel diaspora relations, Jewish communities throughout the world, and the integration of old and new immigrants in Israel. Among the many roles that Michal has had as a member of the parliament, she has been chair of the subcommittee on Israel diaspora relations and member of the women's right and immigration and integration committees. Prior to becoming a member of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, Michal has served as a research fellow at the Institute of Counterterrorism and IDC, and she was also a board member at Tzav Plus, an NGO dedicated to creating opportunities to connect Israelis among the secular and religious spectrum. She was also dedicated legal advisor to the Golden family, working for the return of the deceased Israeli soldiers Hadar Golden and Oron Shaul. Thank you so much for being here. This is such an impressive bio. There's so many questions that just by reading the bio, we already want to ask you. And we are going to talk about a lot of things in this interview. And again, I'm saying if you have any questions that you want to ask or something that you want to share, please type in the comments. But the first question I want to ask you, and this is a woman in politics interview, and you are in the Born to Do Business Global Community Facebook group. So most of the people here are purpose-driven entrepreneurs, people that want to have an impact, that have a purpose, that want to contribute. Those are most of the people here. And I want to ask you, do we think from the beginning that we're going to be in politics? Does it happen, throughout your years? How did it happen to you that you knew that you were going to be in politics from the beginning? Was it you're born to do? Or was it something you discovered later? Can you share with us how did this happen for you?
So it's a very interesting question. And first of all, you said the key word, you said impact. But I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and maybe, then we can ask ourselves whether it was born to do or I really think I, sort of dictated my own path. I was actually born in Jerusalem, as you mentioned, and my mother was the parliamentary secretary for the Likud party for Menachem Begin. So the night of what's known as, the overturn of the government after many, many years of one party in government, the Mapai party, 1977, literally a word was coined that night called the Mahapach. That night, the Menachem Begin rose to power. Actually, I was in the Knesset as a 7-year-old girl between giants of that generation, MKs, the likes of Esther Ziel Naor and Yechiel Kadishai, really giants of Jewish history, giants of this country. And I was the comic relief. I was just a little girl in this excitement and euphoria. But I was really, really honored because, first of all, leading up to obviously those first 7 years, I was roaming the corridors of the Knesset, playing hide and seek with, the likes of Ariel Sharon. But after that night, when Menachem Begin came into power, I was also had the tremendous honor to know the Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, and his wife, Aliza Begin. And we're in a program called Women in Politics, or, with your angle on women. And I want to say in that vein that Aliza Begin, Zichra Livracha, was an incredible powerhouse. And when we talk about the societal changes in the state of Israel and what she brought with her humility and her quiet, but the understanding that in order, for example, to enable social mobility, you had to move families out of very difficult neighborhoods and offer better schooling and so forth. And so my mother and I was, my mother raised me alone. So she would take me with her to these evenings with mothers, with women in the room, with Elisa
Wow.
Begin, who would convince them to move out of their neighborhoods to better housing, to community housing and so forth. And so so maybe I don't know to answer the question whether it was an obvious that I would end up in politics. That's one angle of it. My mother then married a human rights activist, Erwin Cotler, and really I was the beneficiary of understanding that human rights struggles around the world are ours. They are our responsibility. They are not the person that's struggling. In that sense, I met the case and cause of Anatoly Sharansky, today known as Natan Sharansky, because my father represented him along with other refuseniks. And again, another amazing woman that we don't speak of enough, and that is Avital Sharansky. So you have to remember and know that the day after Avital and Natan were married, she received her permit to leave and come to Israel, and he did not. And 12 years later was the next time that they met. And in those 12 years, Avital found her voice and met with world leaders and made this case accessible and insisted that all countries, all leaders of countries, including, of course, the legal case and cause, which my father was, very, very significant to. And so, at the end of the day, and those are the things I spoke about in my maiden speech. And you referred to one more case that, brought me to Knesset, and that is the case and cause of Hadar Golden and Oron Shaul. And there too, two deceased soldiers, alongside two civilians, actually, Avera Mengistu and Shama Sayed. It is the mothers of those four Israeli citizens. It is their mothers that are awaiting their return home. It is their mothers that when I'm involved in creating and creating the legal case that we plead, whether it's in the UN or with foreign ministers around the world, or in our own Knesset in the Foreign Affairs and Security Committee, those are the inspirations for what I do and what I've done in Knesset. So I don't know if I was born to do, but now that I've answered such a long-winded answer, go back to your first word, and that is impact. The born to do piece is where we can have impact, and whatever platform it is that we can advance the issues, the causes, the voices that we represent, that we're committed to, that is what we're born to do. The Knesset is a very important platform. It's where policy is made. It's where decisions can be changed. It's where law is made. And it's the reason that I wanted to enter Knesset. But born to do is not always where you do it. What you were born to do can be done in many places.
Wow, this is music to my ears. Really, that's amazing. I love this this perspective, and of course, we are all very motivated by impact and by contribution, and that leads me to a great transition to my next question, which is you've chosen to be in politics because of the impact. Like I said, people here in this group are mostly entrepreneurs, purpose-driven entrepreneurs, mostly women. They also want to have an impact. But I'm going to ask you this question. Do you think that politics is maybe not the only, but maybe the most effective way to really have an impact on people's lives, because this is the place where laws are made, and because this is the place where we think in a macro way of the society? But do you think that this is the only way, or do you think that there are other ways to have an impact? And how do you compare the different ways of having an impact?
Absolutely, it is not the only place. I'll say there are incredibly important places to make impact. And when you look at the business sector, which you mentioned, you look at the third sector in the state of Israel, you look at what, organizations the likes of Liket or Shalva or Beit Easy, there are 40,000 non-for-profit organizations in this country. So when you talk about, depending on the kind of impact, social impact, educational impact, business impact, then there is definitely many, many more places in which we can have that and make a contribution. And certainly, and I say this very often, we sort of forget that the state of Israel is only 72 years old. That means that, meaning I have parents that remember when the state of Israel did not exist, you know, and that means that we have to remember and take responsibility in our generation too for the fact that we are still the founding generation. So maybe the founding mothers and fathers, as we remember them, as we think of them, they laid down the physical infrastructure, but it is our generation that has a tremendous responsibility to lean in and make impact and make contribution to this country that is really a nascent state. Yes, of indigenous people returning to its homeland and so on. And yes, it's a prosperous country. And, you know, when we look outside the window or we drive from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, it's unbelievable to think that it didn't exist 72 years old. And sometimes it's easy to take for granted. But I would dare say that there are so many avenues in which to make a contribution, in which to make impact. And it also depends on our stage in life. And, at different times, we identify different platforms from which it is most impactful to represent the issues, the subjects, the abilities that we bring to the table. That's certainly my experience. I mean, I've been in the private sector as a lawyer. I've been in the public sector as an attorney. I've been a researcher and academic. And each of those junctions in my own career, in my own professional life, in my own academic life, in my own personal life, have led to the next platform from which to impact and make change. The only thing I'd say about that is not to hesitate to jump from platform to platform, because sometimes we can get stuck, right? We know one thing and we say, well, I know this, and so I dare not venture into the next platform. And I think that actually, and I think this about Olim as well, it's those multiple identities, those cross-fertilizations of whether it's, sectors, business to education, to politics, to entrepreneurship, to philanthropy. Those different sectors, they inform each other and they add so much to the equation. When I say to Olim, it's your multiple identities that you bring to the table. Don't check any of them at the door. You don't need to check any of them at the door. It's actually the importance of multiple identities or multiple competencies, being able to coexist in harmony and inform one another, that make our voices and the viewpoint diversity we bring with us so much more impactful. And I'll say one more thing, which sometimes gets lost in the shuffle with regards to women, and that is, for those of us that have children, I think that, we'll be, I hope, our children at least, will be living in a generation that actually recognizes that. So whether you're mothers or fathers, but certainly mothers as women that not only develop themselves, contribute to general society, but also find ways to run a household, to raise children. That is not something that should take away from what they've done. The opposite. I say this all the time, and it took me being 50 to be able to say this. I learned so much of what I know from what I had to do in my own home, in terms of juggling, in terms of leadership skills, in terms of being a role model, in terms of being the change you want to see in the world. There are so many things that, that's not to say that our children should be guinea pigs, but that we experience and experiment and understand and learn through having a family. And so that is something else that hopefully will be valued in what we contribute, not only to our internal sort of homes, but what we bring with us to the experience outside of the home.
Definitely. And we have someone here who says, incredible, Michal, thank you for your eloquence and your dedication. And again, like I always say in those interviews, I don't see the names of the people in the StreamYard tool, but we'll be able to see the names after. So we were talking about the different types of impact, whether through politics, through business, through philanthropy, and now you actually are talking about the difference between women, women that are at home, and how do they bring their contribution inside the home, outside the home, which takes me to my next question, which is, how would you identify the differences between a masculine type of leadership and a feminine type of leadership? So obviously feminine is including being a mother and what you said about also learning from our leadership inside the home. But how do you identify those two types of leadership? And do you see those differences or similarities in the political scene? Like how is that obvious when you sit at the Knesset? And obviously, we are better now with numbers, and we have more and more women in the political scene. Maybe not enough yet, but more and more. But how do you see the way of expressing the leadership from the women, feminine side of leadership and masculine side of leadership? How do you observe the differences?
So first of all, I think that different cultures, different countries have a different understanding. We're at different places on that journey, for better and for worse. I think that in Israel, the most important piece that I want to say about that is the viewpoint diversity benefits everybody. So having gender parity around the table, it doesn't benefit women. It benefits everybody because of the gender because of the word is gone, because of the viewpoint diversity that women bring with them. That's all. For no other reason. It's also because they are women. And from that perspective, I want to say that in Knesset, that's not always easy. So being one of two women, for example, in the Foreign Relations and Defense Committee, I can tell you that challenging paradigms or asking my peers, my colleagues, to challenge paradigms that they've always held, they're holding on to paradigms that they bring with them from the military. And by definition, because the military is very, very masculine, although that's changing too, right? We see women now. When I was in the Army, I served as a lone soldier in the Army. It was at the time that Alice Miller actually petitioned the High Court of Justice to enable women to try to become pilots. And now we have female pilots. I mean, women are integrated in many of the, I'm not saying everywhere, but in many of the positions available to men in the Army. And so that may change as well. And the one thing that I'll say about that is that there is a sense that the I don't know if I don't want to attribute it to female leadership versus male leadership, but the ability to collaborate, the ability to coalesce around ideas and to check ego at the door, I have found much more easily done amongst women than amongst men. And that has very, very serious implications, actually, when we're sitting around a table for a discussion, right? That has the ability to work as a team. And people should know that the committees at the Knesset, committees everywhere, but the committees at the Knesset do very important work together, transcending politics and transcending religious divide and transcending gender. And so the ability to communicate, by the way, and we see it, even COVID-19, of course, has invented nothing. COVID-19 has only shown a big spotlight on everything that each society can both learn about itself to improve and also be very, very proud of and, showcase. In our case, what I would say is look at the countries that COVID-19 has been led by women through the crisis, and look at the communication skills that they have brought with them to something that may not even make sense when I speak around a committee table and say, we need to make the logic accessible to the public. Even when the epidemiological logic changes, and it has, because the doctors didn't necessarily know what we're up against with COVID-19, we have to communicate that to the public, because public trust depends on us being transparent. And in order to be transparent, we must communicate. That's, maybe soft skills, right? When you're talking in like the Defense and Foreign Relations Committee, even in the Law Committee, that sounds like soft skill. To me, that's a basic. And if we attribute that to female leadership, to feminine leadership, then we can look at the countries where, in fact, women are at the helm, women are the prime ministers, and assess how it is that not just the success rate vis-a-vis, God forbid how many people, died from COVID, but how does the public perceive the government's handling of the crisis? And that's not a measurement we know, but when you look at the public trust and the engagement, the level of engagement in the countries where women have led through this crisis, it is significantly better than countries that were not communicative, that did not create that public trust, that were not necessarily transparent with all of the information, not with ill will, just because things change so dramatically, so quickly. So yes, I think it is very important to have women around the table. Two, as I said, gender parity. I'm not saying only women around the table, but it is where gender parity is so critical in order to ensure viewpoint diversity. And I'll end with one little last sort of anecdotal piece. I wrote an article in 2015 called in 2017, called because it's 2017, fashioned on the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, who introduced his cabinet, and behind him were 50% women and 50% men. And one of the journalists said to him, "Mr. Prime Minister, can I ask, is this intentional? The fact that you have half women, half men in your cabinet, or why did you do this?" And Justin Trudeau sort of paused, and there was silence. It was a little awkward. And he looked at the journalist and he said, "Because it's 2015." That was it. It was so clear. And in that sense, there was a lot that we have to strive for. It was so clear that for the sake of everybody in the country, men, women, children, all ages, all of us, there needs to be gender parity around the decision-making tables, so we ensure viewpoint diversity, so that we challenge ourselves from various diverging viewpoints, differing viewpoints, and so that we bring all our skills, whatever they may be, soft or hard, into the room as we make those decisions. And I'm dedicated to doing that and to continuing to do that in Knesset. It's not simple, as I said, in Israel because of the military sort of component, but I'll tell you, it's been very effective in the months that I've had at Knesset. And I've never felt that I don't have a voice. I have always leaned in around any table, whether I'm the only woman or not. And I encourage us all to continue doing that. It is the only way to affect change.
Definitely, totally agree. And we have someone here who says, yes, Jacinda Ardern is the prime example of a great communicator during a crisis. So I think we're all thinking about the same. I love what you're saying about the diversity and how it's a win-win for everyone. It's not only a fight for women. And I also really see this, leaving the ego at the door and having more collaboration. My question is, are those soft skills that women have, or that are more feminine dimension, I would say, because some men have it too, but they have a stronger feminine dimension. But are those soft skills who they would help you with the communication with the people, with building the trust, with everything that you said? Are those soft skills also helping you advancing in your political career? Because the political career internally, with making yourself a place, with having the right, belonging to the right parties, or having your career and advancing your career, do you feel like it's harder for a woman because of those soft skills and because of this less of an ego, more collaboration? So on the one hand, you are bringing results, but on the other hand, isn't it more difficult, or do you find it more difficult for you to advance your own political career in this men-dominated, world?
So it definitely makes it more difficult if the goal is, and I don't know how we measure advance, right? We started with impact. So if the goal is to make impact, and I can tell you that I've made significant impact by other people possibly taking the idea and moving it forward, saying, "Oh, I love this idea. I'm just going to do it." Right? That's a challenge with in theory, if you're measuring by where you've gotten, and we have to find a balance. It is definitely something to be aware of, certainly in politics, and by the way, certainly in business, and where we have the opportunity to identify and to grow women. It's also everywhere, I would say, in politics as well. The importance of creating succession, of growing leadership, of growing future leadership. I think that places an onus on us to identify when there are women around the table that are actually the sources of ideas that are then, wonderful because they make an impact, but are not necessarily attributed to them, and then hold them back. That gives us another tremendous responsibility. The higher up we move along the echelons of whatever, be it business, politics, or anywhere else, I think that is something to be very aware of. It's good that you've pointed it out, and thank you for pointing that out, because of course it can be a double-edged sword. I will say where it's important to make others realize that viewpoint diversity is not about women. And I've said this often at the Women's Status Committee. I'm actually troubled when we have discussions in the Women's Status Committee with women sitting around the table. It happened to be that the chair of the Women's Status Committee in this last Knesset was a man. Okay. It's the second time that's happened. And all the rest of the members were women. Mm-hmm. And I shared that I had the same sort of troubling feeling when the issues that came to the fore at the committee were real, like issues of, domestic violence and very challenging issues that should not be, in my view, in the Women's Status Committee. Because the minute that they're only heard in the Women's Status Committee, it's as if they only affect women, which is not the case. And where I learned that for the first time is actually when I was the commissioner for the prevention of sexual harassment at a large university in Israel for several years. And whenever we'd have conferences, and I'd come to speak at the conference, there would be 200 women in a room. So we were speaking to ourselves about sexual harassment.
Right.
And I remember one year saying, we're never going to get anywhere like this. This is just not going to work. Not even the presidents of the universities, most of them who were men, were present in the room. So if just the commissioners of sexual harassment, who are all women, are talking to each other about sexual harassment, how are we going to make this trickle up, down, out, everywhere it has to go? And that is something that our societies have to be much better at. Certainly Israel as well. So there are issues of strategic importance, of internal resiliency of a society that are not issues. Domestic violence is not an issue of women. It's not. It's just not. And we should be discussing it at the most important committee where everybody is around the table. And so that is something to be aware of. And you're right that it can be a double-edged sword to be too collaborative. But I think at the end of the day, if we measure it according to impact, then the satisfaction that certainly I have received over time from being collaborative in that way has far outweighed any possible detriment in advancing me.
Amazing. Love this answer. And you also spoke before about leaning in. So I can't help but, thinking about Sheryl Sandberg and her book, Lean In, and she's like a master in talking about how women really like the responsibility of being around the table or coming around the table is first and foremost a woman's responsibility, and not waiting for men to invite us or to make room for us. And because we are a community of purpose-driven, essentially women entrepreneurs, and if we have men listening to us, thank you for being here. This is not just a women conversation, of course, but I would love to hear what you have to say to women who are developing their business, are thinking about which impact they can bring to the world, how they can contribute with their gift. What would be the advice that you would give them in terms of leaning in? Like, what would you say, come to the table, be in the conversation? What would be the best advice you would give them to be able to do that, maybe from your own experience, or what would be an advice that you can give to them for that?
The most important thing is really to listen to your inner voice. At the end of the day, there is something about, I don't want to speak for others, but about women women that I know, that makes us hold back, before we speak, right? That keeps us from leaning in, that sort of has us a little bit resistant from leaning in and just speaking up and just saying what it is in that inner voice that we know. And the most important thing that I can say is to trust that intuition, to trust that voice, to actually fade out all the background noise that tells you, nah, maybe that's dumb, or you shouldn't say that, or maybe that person, just said something like it. Or lean in means actually leaning in physically and sounding your voice. And you'd be amazed to witness the fact that once you sound that voice and once you repeat several times what that voice says to you, then there are real ramifications, in terms of the surroundings that actually seek out your voice. And so then, I think that that's also a process, right? If somebody seeks out your voice and you receive that validation, then you no longer have to recognize it yourself when others acknowledge how important it is. The first piece of advice, and I'm sure that this is true in terms of impact in the business sector as well, and in terms of just believing in yourself, in listening to that inner voice and saying, I have what to offer. Acknowledging that I have what to offer, and maybe there are 10 other people that have something else to offer, but I have what to offer that's really important, that's significant. That would be something that I would encourage, actually, anybody, whether there are women entrepreneurs in the business sector that are looking to make an impact, and certainly younger women, certainly women who are juggling so much. And when I look back at juggling a young family, now I have an older family, my kids are, a little bit older. It's a very different stage in life. It is very overwhelming in the way that we judge ourselves. And as I said, just because we can do everything doesn't mean we have to do everything ourselves. And I'll say this also for Olim, for Olot, who are on this call, who are here very often alone, and the infrastructure of support that many of us have around us is much more limited than our Israeli peers. We don't have parents around. We don't necessarily have parents-in-law around. We don't necessarily have the infrastructure of friendship or groups that we grew up with that are sort of a sounding board or a safe space to sound our ideas in. So that sort of lonely sort of capsule in which we are individuals, and that's why I applaud you for having this group, because I'm sure that this group serves as a tremendous source of support for all the women that are here, and men too, of course, as partners in this, but for all the women that are here as a sounding board, as somewhere that is safe to, sort of try out your ideas. And that's another really good piece of advice, actually. There is nothing I have done, including in the last year in the Knesset, that I haven't sounded off a few real mentors that I have been fortunate to gather over time, whether it be, a Supreme Court judge that I worked for or a good friend. It doesn't matter. To identify places where you can feel that you are safe and sounding what you would propose maybe around a table that you're a little more insecure, to run it by that person and to receive the kind of acknowledgement and empowerment that you need in order to lean in. Do what you need to do, but don't stop yourself from leaning in and sounding your voice.
Amazing. Wow, I could listen to you for hours. This is really amazing. And we are going to finish with the last question that I'm so curious to know. If someone, a woman, would want to go into politics in Israel, just like you said, in this context of military, cultural, environment that we're in, and a very patriarchal also society. Israel is a very traditional society. What would be the advice that you would give to a woman if someone is maybe thinking of going into politics? Would you say, like, don't even think about it, it's too difficult? Or do you think we need more women in politics? Like, what would be the advice that you would say, yes, come into politics, but make sure that, like, what would you say? What would you say to someone who would want to come into politics?
So first of all, it's the advice that I'm giving myself right now, because I'm not sure if you know, but I'm not running in the upcoming elections. So I am a member of Knesset, and we're heading into another election. And I myself am not on any of the party slates after, sort of announcing that I would not be running with Blue and White, which is the party I came in with. And after several discussions with the party leaders, all of the men, and recognizing that in order to serve my constituencies, my subjects, and sound my voice, this was not the best timing from any of the platforms that were, relevant for me to join. So this is my advice, not only to those who may be listening and interested and contemplating, it's advice to myself. We have the responsibility, and maybe it goes back to where I started, in this generation, to lead this incredible miracle that is the state of Israel, 72 years old, to propel it forward so that it continues to exist. We are the bridges, the translators, and women even more, I would say, are the translators between where we want or how we want this country to look and how it looks now. Because of what we talked about, because of the importance of being those bridges and communicating and making things accessible and recognizing the importance of good governance or equal access to education or equal access to healthcare, or so much what we've seen over COVID-19, mental health, which is, we have such a long way to go in that regard as well. Really, everyday life, one. Everyday life in the state of Israel. Two, Israel diaspora relations. They're highly about communication. The importance right now of being that bridge, of translating, and I don't mean language, translating the gap between Israel and diaspora. We have a tremendous role to play there. Three, we talked about communication. And again, these are the issues that brought me into Knesset. The importance of communicating Israel's standing to the international community, Israel's challenges to the international community. So I know international law. I know to use the language of international law to make that accessible. But beyond that, I know that I need to communicate. I know that I need to engage with my peers in parliaments around the world, with heads of state, making accessible what it is that the state of Israel, as Jewish and democratic, has not only to offer in terms of its own existence, but in its engagement with the rest of the world. In order to what we know is one of the biggest challenges of our time, the very legitimacy of the state of Israel to exist, in order to address challenges that we may not be aware of in Israel, but challenges of anti-Semitism as a form of disinformation. So we're at an intersection where we didn't even talk about the Abraham Accords and how important they are in terms of the potential. We are at a historic intersection, by the way, for business purposes too, an incredible, incredible opportunity right there, because it's a people-to-people piece of which the likes I've never experienced. I had the privilege of hosting a first ever delegation from the UAE and Bahrain and Egypt in the Knesset. And there is a real sense of wanting to develop and deepen these relationships, including, in entrepreneurship and business and so on. But we are at an intersection, a historic junction, where I believe that we have not only the ability, but the responsibility to, as you so aptly said, lean in, quoting Sheryl Sandberg, and taking our rightful place around the decision-making tables and sounding our voices so that we can really realize the tremendous potential of the time that we're living in. And COVID-19 has been nothing but an opportunity alongside the challenges that it presents. And I'm going to end with one little thing, which, whenever I engage, and I wish I could see everybody here and hear from you instead of you only hearing from me, whenever I engage with any group, and I've had the opportunity to do so, I leave feeling very hopeful, because I know that there is so much energy, good energy, of people wanting to make a contribution, wanting to have an impact, seeking ways to best do that. And it really makes me think of the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs's differentiation between hope and optimism. And he said the following. He said, optimism is the belief that everything is going to be okay. Hope is the belief that you have to make it okay. In that sense, optimism is very passive, whereas hope is very active. And it takes no courage at all to be an optimist, but it takes a great deal of courage to have hope. And so that's where we're living. And exchanges like this leave me very hopeful, knowing that we have to be active in our leaning in and sounding our voices, and courageous. It's not that it's easy. I'm not for a second minimizing it, but I know we can do it.
And listening to you, it sounds really, really doable. Thank you so much for giving us this inspiration, empowering, and it's so much into the impact that you were talking about, and also the mixture with this strong, impactful empowerment, but also the feminine, and you knowing how to manage those soft skills and how to talk about it and how to talk to other women. Thank you so much for being here. This has been really a pleasure for me, and I know for everyone who's been listening to be inspired by you. And I can only wish that Israeli politics is going to be full of more women and people like you, because that's what we need. That's exactly what we need. We need that for our little country.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the opportunity. And I have no intention of going away. I am committed to continue sounding this voice, advancing these issues, and hopefully not too soon, because we don't want elections every 6 months, but hopefully returning to Knesset to sound this voice there as well. So thank you.
Amazing. And I see people saying this was incredible. Thank you. All the feedbacks, and you're welcome to, read the feedbacks in the group. Thank you so much, Michal. And we really hope to see you more in politics and more leading us. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.